Hi everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the United States Air Force Band Ceremonial Brass Trumpet opening in Washington, D.C. This is a position that I held in the 2000s, and many of you already know what a great job this is, including great benefits, performing for high-profile functions, and performing with great musicians. In this video, I'm performing and providing commentary for every excerpt on the list for the pre-screen round, which is due on November 1st, and the live audition round, which is on December 6th. I hope you find this information helpful. It should be noted that although I am a former member of the United States Air Force Band, the opinions in this video are my own, based on my own experiences. I've certainly helped a number of students win auditions for these groups and consider these jobs worthy of taking a close look. If you're new to this channel, I'm releasing a new video every other Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, all things trumpet with a focus on fundamentals, performance, pedagogy, and audition strategies. If you're enjoying this content, please click the subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. It's my commitment to bring you new content here regularly. Also at the end, stick around for a couple of promotions that I'm going to be doing. Before we jump into the excerpts, I want to quickly discuss some details with regard to the pre-screen preliminary round that is due on November 1st, which includes a resume and an MP3 recording. Just a quick word about the MP3 recordings. There are 5 excerpts that are required for this: the Bugle Call to the Color, an excerpt from Charlier 6, John Williams' Summon the Heroes trumpet solo, Ives' Variations on America, and the opening to the Hindemith's Symphony in B-flat. Although you're not typically allowed to edit the recording for your pre-screen audition, you'll want to put your absolute best foot forward on these recordings. The committee is likely going to hear over 100 of these recordings. If it's not the best version of you, you will not be considered for the live round. I can't emphasize this enough. For the pre-screen recordings, I recommend to add a little bit of nuance when recording. In other words, if you're recording from your apartment and you can make it sound like you're in a hall and it's within reason, go for it. The technology is easily available. However, if you overdo this and it becomes a distraction to the listener, it can work in the other direction. My biggest point is to make sure that these excerpts for the pre-screen round are the absolute best that they can possibly be. Consider these tapes to be the most important project that you have going right now. If you have any questions about this, feel free to comment and I'll get back to you. Now let's dig into the excerpts. Taps is easily the most important excerpt on this list, simply because this is a huge part of the job. You can tell so much about intonation, sound, and musicality from this one. If these areas lack in your sounding of taps, it could be an automatic disqualifier. A great taps has these elements: a beautiful sound, a musical arch, and a touch of natural vibrato, as if you were singing it. As far as where to breathe, that's open to interpretation. I've heard great players breathe in different spots. I can speak to where I breathe, but the biggest thing in my opinion is to not have gaping holes where the breath takes place. You want to keep the musical line going throughout, and the breath can't get in the way of that. I breathe after all of the fermatas, including the first one. Many players won't breathe until the second fermata. Both are acceptable. I also like to grab a quick breath before the pickups to the third fermata to keep my air supply up for the long fermata note. Then the last 2 breaths are pretty obvious, after the fermata and then before the last 3 notes. The last note is a very important one. I start with a straight tone, add a little bit of vibrato, and try to fade away to nothing. For more information on taps, check out my video that I did previously, which includes context and history. Let's take a listen to taps. To the Colors is another bugle call. This one is used if a band or singer is not present to perform the national anthem. For the Ceremonial brass audition, they are specific about the tempo being quarter note equals 144, so definitely observe that. My approach on this one is to perform it in an orchestral fashion, paying careful attention to intonation. You don't want to overblow this one. Trust your resonance and perform with a lot of energy. Let's take a listen to the bugle call To the Color. Let's take a look at Charlier Etude number 6. Years ago, I was in a master class with Alan Dean where he mentioned that generally speaking, he teaches his students and in his own performance to play these etudes more or less in time. While Charlier does give us room for freedom at times in his etudes, I've adopted Alan's approach to basically play them in time, with exceptions, of course. If you're too free with these etudes, they can get a little sloppy, and freedom and rubato can start to sound like bad rhythm. This etude is marked andante cantabile, and the French at the beginning means without delay, so not too slow on this one. More specifically, we have a half note marking of 63 beats per minute. Additionally, there's a dolce marking, so our approach to this one should be to play lyrically and beautifully. In his etudes, Charlier uses a sort of V marking for a breath mark. Make sure to take those as they're meant to be a specific break in the music. At the espressivo in measure 13, I interpret that to be a bit of a retard leading into the breath mark, and then a tempo in measure 14. In measure 17 through 20, I like to keep these trill bars in time, which means we don't have a lot of time for the trills. In those accents in measure 23 and into measure 24, those need to pop a little bit. I like to achieve that by playing long, full-valued accented notes as opposed to shortening them up. They seem to have a little more pop that way. At the end of measure 26, I like to do a slight slowdown to set up the poco a poco stringendo in measures 27 through 29. And the poco a poco stringendo in 27 through 29, make sure to do exactly that. In measure 30, it's marked senza stringendo. I like to do a small retard there to set up the ad-lib measures in 31 and 32. Speaking of the ad-lib bars, I like to play these two bars in sort of a halftime feel, and then immediately a tempo at measure 33. In measures 33 and 34, I like to push forward until giving way to the retard in measure 35. Earlier, I did a complete video dedicated to Charlier Etude number 6, so check that out. Now let's take a listen to this excerpt from Charlier Etude number 6. So the Festival Variations excerpt is marked quarter note equals 152 in the score. I think a tempo between 144 and 152 would be just fine. Anything much faster and it starts to sound a little chaotic and out of control. I went back and clocked the premiere performance of the Air Force Band, and they were a couple of clicks under the 152 marking. For those reasons, I think quarter note equals 144 is an effective tempo as well. In the excerpt, the trumpet solo is actually a trio with bassoon playing an octave lower and piccolo playing an octave higher. In measures 55 and 56, the quarter note equals the dotted quarter note, so the pulse remains the same. Also, there's a mistake in the original trumpet part in measure 56. It should be a G natural. Make sure the accents pop throughout, and note the passage is basically mezzo forte throughout. It's really easy to overblow this excerpt. I've also done a video dedicated to this particular excerpt, so check that out as well. Now let's take a listen to this excerpt from Festival Variations by Claude T. Smith. This excerpt for Hands Across the C March is pretty straightforward. I like a tempo of half note equals 112 on this one, if for no other reason than 120 just sounds a little bit too fast to me. Additionally, it's really difficult to march at 120, which for the context at which you'll be playing this in the ceremonial brass, you will likely be marching to this one on a ceremony. For that reason, it seems appropriate to take a little bit off the tempo. Pay careful attention to all of the markings on this one, as well as the detail with regard to articulation and dynamics. It's very specific. Let's take a listen to this excerpt from Hands Across the C March. For the opening of Hindemith's Symphony in B flat, I've gone back and forth over the years on where to breathe on this particular excerpt. As with a lot of excerpts, it's actually easier to perform this one in context because it's a unison line and you can stagger your breaths with your colleagues. For my performance of this one today, I took one breath on the tied note in measure 5. Wherever you decide to breathe on this one, make sure that the breath doesn't get in the way of the line. Additionally, you don't want to use vibrato on this one as it will be out of character if you do. Let's take a listen to this excerpt from Hindemith's Symphony in B flat. In Ives Variations on America, the committee is simply measuring your technical facility on this one. I have to admit this excerpt has always been a challenge for me and probably always will be. When I see this come up on audition, it's one of those excerpts that I just immediately have to relearn all over again. But there's hope. When you relearn an excerpt like this, I like to practice on a loop with the metronome at tempo, starting with the end and gradually adding measures as I become more comfortable, trying to strike that groove and build confidence from a technical standpoint. If you do the work and build the confidence on this one, you can pull it off and do it very well. The tempo in the score is 138. I think that's a really good tempo. In addition to technically owning this excerpt, if you can play it with shape that mirrors the My Country 'Tis of Thee melody that is happening in the woodwinds, you'll be just fine. Here's the excerpt from Ives Variations on America. And now for the excerpt from An Outdoor Overture by Aaron Copland. I personally think a good audition tempo for this one is somewhere around quarter note equals 80. Just feels a little rushed to me if it's faster than that. At the beginning, it's marked cantabile, freely with natural expression. The dynamic marking is mezzo piano. I try not to make too much of the marking, instead focusing in on playing nice and easy. If you're focused on playing too softly, we can sometimes get ourselves into trouble as brass players. My approach to this is to play this excerpt rhythmically solid to line up with the simple pizzicato accompaniment figures underneath. It can get sloppy really quick if you don't, which takes away from the expressive nature of the excerpt. I think a nice and simple vibrato can really drive home the natural expression that Copland calls for in the score. On the big leaps throughout on this excerpt, I like to really wait so as to not forecast the next note. Playing the quarter note triplets in time in measures 27 through 29 is very important. Again, it has to stay together with a simple obligato accompaniment underneath. On the low concert B flats at the end, it's really easy to let that sag a little flat, so make sure that you keep the energy up as the line descends at the end. Let's take a listen to a performance of this excerpt from Aaron Copland's An Outdoor Overture. On the opening promenade from Pictures at an Exhibition, I like a tempo of quarter note equals 92 to 96. I used the Mark Hughes phrasing on this one where I phrased a beat 4 in each of the 6/4 bars. This one can be perfectly boring if we don't phrase it. Also, by phrasing to the 4th beat of the 6/4 bars, it takes the pressure off the octave F and A flats toward the end as you're phrasing to the note after the high note in those octaves. Let's take a listen to the opening of Pictures at an Exhibition. On the Pines of Rome offstage solo, in addition to playing the correct notes with a great pulse and playing with great intonation, it's also important to phrase this one to the more important notes. For example, a few notes that I like to phrase to on this one include the G in the 2nd bar of the solo, the F sharp in the 4th bar of the solo, the A in the 6th bar, and the G in the next to last measure. Those are just a few spots that you may want to consider phrasing to, and it can certainly help make this one more interesting and expressive as it is marked in the score. Let's take a listen to the Pines offstage solo. On the John Williams Summon the Heroes excerpt, I always like to say that if you can sound like Tim Morrison on this one, you can win the excerpt. After all, John Williams dedicated this to Tim Morrison and they recorded it together with the Boston Pops. The solo is marked mezzo forte. It's really easy to overplay this one. To help with that, I almost think of it as a mezzo piano at the beginning so that I have somewhere to go. Certainly in auditions, our tendency, or at least my tendency, is to overplay, and so that's a good reminder for me. So let's take a look at the first 6 full bars with the pickup notes. I like to approach this excerpt very lyrically. John Williams marks majestically at the beginning. We are trumpet players. Sometimes we can go too far with the majestically thing. In the 3rd bar of the solo, Williams writes cantabile, which basically means a smooth singing style. You can maybe dig in a little bit on the fanfare licks in the middle of the 2nd full bar, but the focus should be playing this lyrically and beautifully and with ease. On the septuplet figure 6 measures from the end, I like to stylize it a little bit. Again, just trying to play it like Tim Morrison would. Let's take a listen to the Summon the Heroes excerpt by John Williams. In the Persichetti excerpt, the tempo should be around 54 to 60 beats per minute. At the beginning, it's marked mezzo piano and dolce. The idea is to connect the notes to form a long, beautiful line. In the crescendo in measures 3 and 4, I like to go all the way to the downbeat of measure 5, using the quarter note rest as a breath mark. It's important to keep the momentum going and not let the rest get in the way of the direction of the phrase. In measures 13 through 16, the dynamic is in the context of piano with the crescendo and decrescendo in the phrase. I like to phrase to the downbeat in measure 16, as I think the written B is the most important note in the phrase, and then decrescendo into the written G sharp in the same bar. In measures 16 through 25, it's important not to forecast the next note, especially on the larger intervals. You want to hang on to each note as long as you can, adding to the expressive nature of these phrases. On the octave A's in measure 23, I like to lightly tongue the upper note for extra security. You can disguise the tongue by adding a slight crescendo in the second space A and then lightly tongue the octave. In measures 25 through 27, like I mentioned earlier, you want to wait and not forecast the next note on the intervals. It's easy to rush ahead. Again, this adds to the expression. Also, I like to phrase to the C sharp in measure 27 before giving way to the decrescendo. In measures 29 through 32, we have a bit of a recap to the opening phrase, only this time it's marked mezzo forte. Feel free to play freely and add that extra layer of sound. On the last two notes, I like to slightly tongue the upper note on the octave. Like I mentioned before in an earlier passage, you can disguise this by accelerating the air on the octave, and then just add a light articulation on the upper note for extra security. On the long note, I prefer to start the note with no vibrato and then adding a little bit of vibrato toward the end of the note. Let's take a listen to the fifth movement of Persichetti's Divertimento for band. On the Queen City March excerpt, I like to go no faster than half note equals 112 on this one. Like I mentioned on the Hands Across the Sea excerpt, you will be marching to this one on the job. And if you take it too fast, marching begins to feel like running. This one you will have to memorize because the committee will likely want to see if you can march and play. Musically speaking, observe all of the details with regard to articulation and dynamic. Like most marches, the composers are very descript. Let's take a listen to this excerpt from Queen City March. If you'd like to request a coaching for this audition, don't hesitate to reach out at chriswilsontrumpet.com. That's chriswilsontrumpet.com. Also, I'm getting really close to 1K subscribers. Thank you all so much for subscribing to this channel. If you subscribe to this channel and help me get to 1K subscribers, I will automatically enter you for a drawing to give away a Mark Hughes practice mute. These practice mutes are fantastic. Check out the unboxing and review that I did a while back. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.